Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Every day for 5 years in music school, I would stop by the same posted quote in front of one of my favorite professors' offices, trying to figure it out. Now, I knew that I understood some of it, but I just didn't have the sophistication at the time, I wouldn't have phrased it that way, to really understand the implications, and I guess I wanted to understand it. And the quote was by John Cage from a series of essays, and the quote is, "Which is more musical, a truck passing by a factory or a truck passing by a music school? Are the people inside the school musical and the ones outside unmusical? What if the ones inside can't hear very well? Would that change my question?" I actually love the form and the structure of this quote. It's actually quite rabbinical. It reminds me a lot of the presentation of threes. The number 3 is typological in Jewish tradition. It means human completion, right? As opposed to heavenly completion, which is 7. Then Pirkei Avot, which is aphorisms and thoughts and teachings that are to bring us to a higher level of ourselves. And we get such things as Al Shlosha Devarim, upon these 3 things the world rests, on Torah and Avodah, Gimel Chasadim. But we also, and it's one of my favorite quotes, and one of the most popular from Pirkei Avot is from Hillel. Im ein ani li, mi li, uksha'ani, le'atzmi, ma'ani, v'im lo akshav ematai. If I am not for me, who will be for me? And when I am for myself alone, what am I? And if not now, then when? Right? The idea of the 3 is to open up a gateway, and then once you're able to process that first question, then you move into the second one, which is deeper, and it can't be processed without really having apprehended the first, and then you move on to the third, which usually twists things around a little bit, and it just makes you kind of uncomfortable and unsteady, that allows for the true transformation. And that's what we get as well. The first part of this, which is more musical, a truck passing outside a music school or outside a factory, that gives us our original statement, where we're forced to think in terms of our individual experiences and our predilections and our education. The second is a more qualitative and quantitative question. Even judgmental. Is someone more musical who is in that music school as opposed to someone who's outside of it? And then finally throwing it on its ear, asking us, well, what assumptions did we make when we were visualizing then the people who were on the inside? To try to make it a little bit more concrete, I think this quote is doing 3 things. First of all, it's having us focus on the uniqueness of experiences and the combination of those experiences from who we are, let's just say genetically, combined with who we become through life experience. The second is then making a statement based on that combination of completely genetic inherent factors combined with what programs us, what we choose to program, what our life experiences then do with that general predilection, and say, well, we can experience something that's exactly the same as someone else and have 2 radically different conclusions or experiences of that thing. And finally, and perhaps the very purposeful dark part of this quote, what does it mean to be on the inside and the outside? Anyone who's ever found themselves on the outside, whether through personal decision or through the actions of others, knows not only is that terrifying and unpleasant, but it completely changes how you look at what's happening on the inside, which is really that last part of the quote. What we're really saying is, what did we assume when we assumed that they were more musical? Why were they even in the music school to begin with? Was it because they loved music? Was someone who was inside the music school getting ready to vandalize it? What allows someone to be on the inside and the outside? Well, that's a little bit more complicated, isn't it? Now, tying these thoughts to Torah, there is a stunning Rashi interpretation at the very end of Parashat Nasso. So the 3rd triennial cycle of Parashat Nasso, we're in the 2nd Parasha of the book of Numbers, and the last part of Nasso, oh boy, if you had this for your bar and bat mitzvah portion, you got tired of counting sheep, am I right? Okay, this is a list of the donations and sacrifices that were given by tribal chieftains for the dedication of the tabernacle. And when you get to the very end, we have an isolated verse, right? It's a verse that deals with how the Eternal spoke with Moses in the tent of meeting, and it is not related to what came before. It's an isolate. This is chapter 7, verse 89 of Numbers, and we read, "When Moses went into the tent of meeting to speak with God, he would hear the voice, the divine voice, addressing him from above the cover that was on the top of the ark of the pact between the 2 cherubim. Thus God spoke to him." It's a great verse. I've done an awful lot of sermons on the Ark of the Covenant and on the cherubim over time. If you want to flip back through some of the sermons on this channel, you will even find that I've talked about it recently. But there are a few strange things here. And there's a lot of commentators who really focus on the me'al hakaport, from above the covering. And indeed, Rashi spends a lot of time on that, and his explanation is interesting. You can go to Sefaria and you can read his first explanation. It is translated into very good English. But then he continues with the Vaishma et hakol, and he would hear the voice, hear the divine voice. And he's really thinking subtly, because wait a second here. If the divine voice is speaking, shouldn't this be something, if the divine voice is this massive universal thing, shouldn't this be something that's heard by everyone? But if not everyone else is hearing it, then maybe it's a whisper, and that's kind of what Rashi starts at. We read, one might think it was a very low voice. Scripture, however, states the voice, hakol, with the definite article, the well-known voice, the voice. We're talking about the voice, not some other voice, the voice. It was that thunderous voice which the Eternal spoke to Moses on Sinai, and yet when it reached the door of the appointed tent, it broke off and did not issue beyond the appointed tent. So it's not that the voice was quiet for the sake of Moses, the voice was stopped before it got outside. Quoting once again, 2 weeks in a row, the Lubavitcher Rebbe has a great interpretation of this. I actually disagree with it, but it's a great interpretation of this, using this as a proof for free will. How is that? Well, the divine voice is a gigantic thing that permeates everything, but we can choose to hear it or not hear it. That's the idea of the inside the tent versus outside the tent. He's taking it completely metaphorically, which I'm completely down with. And why is it that we don't all hear the divine voice or hear it in the same way of Moses? Well, in this case, it's because we can at any time know what the right thing to do is, but still choose to not do it. The divine voice is all around us. We can choose to not hear it. It's a great explanation, but I'm going to take what's written here a little bit more literally for a second, because we weren't allowed to enter the tent. And that makes this a bit of an issue, right? It's all fine and dandy to say, hey, we all have access to the divine voice, but that's not necessarily what Torah is teaching. Torah gives us this image, starting with the 10 utterances, starting with the giving of the law on Sinai, that people, when they got too near the voice, their souls started coming out. And the text in Exodus between the Eternal and Moses is, tell the people to go back down the mountain because the voice is too intense for them. They are losing their souls. None of us can face what it means to be in the fullness of the divine voice, which an explanation of that is probably a slightly different sermon. But as a result, Moshe Rabbeinu, he's the one who gets to hear the divine voice, and the place where that happens is from the Ark of the Covenant inside the tent. And if you don't believe me, all the bad things that Torah clearly says happens if we get into the tent in front of the Ark of the Covenant, just watch Raiders of the Lost Ark at the very end, and that will clearly tell you what Torah is trying to tell us.
Marion, don't look at it. Shut your eyes, Marion. Don't look at it no matter what happens.
Right, you get the idea. Torah's making it pretty clear that we're not supposed to be in that place where Rashi said the divine voice could be heard. So how do we actually understand this? And I'm going to jump back into music, jump back into our wonderful quote of John Cage in order to explore this a little bit. And I'm going to use musical dichotomies. So, for example, I can use the dichotomy of, let's say, opera and hip-hop. Now, first of all, just the fact that I use that dichotomy, I just want you to be aware of how uncomfortable some of you just got. Okay? You have no idea what I'm going to say, but just be aware of those emotions. I'll even make this even more intense. How about it's Wagner opera and gangster rap? Okay? Now, I haven't made any qualitative judgments, but a whole lot of assumptions have just been made just by me using that. That's not where I'm going to go at all. I could have used another dichotomy. I could have used the dichotomy of country western and late 90s German-based jungle generation 2 house music. Believe me, all four of these mentioned genres can be very, very religious. But look at the levels that we've got. Even if they make us slightly uncomfortable, someone who is going to have a relationship with opera versus a relationship with hip-hop are probably going to have, at the very least, different backgrounds. According to the great movie Pretty Woman, some people are just going to love it and some people not, but I think that it's going to have a lot to do with exposure. I wasn't exposed to much opera in the first opera I went to, Carmen, and when I was 16 years old, I instantly loved and couldn't get enough of it and have loved opera ever since. I also happen to love hip-hop, but that's a completely different discussion. But generally speaking, you are going to have different circumstances that lead to a passionate engagement in either of these types of music. And whether that makes us feel, well, that's self-evident, or whether that makes us feel uncomfortable, I think that that's at least a worthy opening salvo for a good dialogue. The second point is what happens when we're there, when we're inside, when we have developed our relationship with that musical form. This is going to take on its extremes one of two different flavors. It's changed a little bit in the era of social media, where we tend to document every tiny little aspect of our lives instead of actually just enjoying the concert. But just stepping back a few years before that, you would have the musical born again experience versus the I want to keep it to myself, right? I find this thing and I tell everyone that I meet that it's the best thing on the face of this planet and that they should love it too, or I keep it to the group that I find. I'm so happy to have found this in-group who gets this thing that no one else does, that I feel special because of my inclusion into this group. But the questions could be pretty intense when you experience them. Do you know who this is? Why don't you know who this is? What are you lacking that you do not know who this is? Which brings up the message that I think is actually going on in this Rashi interpretation of the divine voice not going past the door in the tent of meeting. And music is a great way to talk about this, because if we've had a religious experience in our lives, I mean, we, as normal people who are not by predilection mystics, if we've had an experience that was that shrinking to the size of an atom and then the universe expanding out, that universal mystical experience, most of us have had it through one of several modalities, and music is one of the biggest of them. The greatest experiences generally I've had in my life have been through music, either playing on stage or being in the presence of a concert that was just mind-numbing, but that was an experience of the divine voice. But this teaching is leading us to the very unpleasant truth that once we hear the divine voice, we don't know what to do with it. And we tend to use it in ways that, quite frankly, block another from having their own experience of hearing the divine voice. Because on the one hand, when we hear the divine voice, we can then all of a sudden demand that someone else hears the divine voice in the same way that we do. And if they don't, that's not the divine voice. And then if someone happens to hear it similarly to how we're hearing it, we demand that they interpret it in the same way that we do. In other words, when do we become instruments of making sure that we're the ones shutting the door to the tent of meeting and making sure that no one else can have access to it? See, here's the secret behind all this. I don't think Moses was trying to keep us from having access to the divine voice. I don't think that that's actually what the purpose of this is, Raiders of the Lost Ark final scene notwithstanding. Because I think that if we were to have been allowed to go into the tent of meeting, to hear the emanation of the divine voice from between the cherubim, from above the Kaporet, what would our experience have been? What was Moses keeping for Moses' self? Well, we wouldn't have heard anything. So that's the last part of the John Cage quote. And if you were to find out that the divine voice was not even a whisper, then what do? How much of our life falls away from underneath our feet? I'm not saying that Moses didn't experience the divine voice. The entire concept of revelation within Jewish tradition is completely predicated on that. But it's not predicated on Moses hearing a literal divine voice. It's predicated on Moses hearing his personal experience of the divine voice. And this Rashi explanation calls us to the question of what are we doing to prevent someone else from having access to the divine voice. All right, this is getting long. I don't know which divine voice I'm going to hear today, but I know somewhere between now and when the Shabbos candle lights are lit tonight, I'm going to have listened to opera, hip-hop, German-based jungle, and a little bit of country western, because I promise you they're all in the mix in there. Somewhere there's truth in between all of them. All of us are limited enough that we need to find our individual voice, our individual dialogue with that voice first, and then welcome other people in to listen with us and make up their own mind, and then find ourselves in someone else's tent and listen to what they're hearing. And over the course of time, our experience of the divine voice becomes bigger and bigger, and we find ourselves no longer keeping people out from our experiences or being kept out from others, but rather learning that the actual experience of the divine voice is much bigger than we ever imagined. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We'll see you next time. Yisrael